The winter had arrived at the high ridge not with a roar, but with a great, heavy silence. Master Silas stood at the window of his workshop, watching the first true snow of the season descend in fat, lazy flakes. They settled upon the dark boughs of the surrounding pines, turning the world into a study of deep greens and brilliant, crystalline whites. Silas had lived on the ridge for 40 years, long enough to know the language of the timber and the temperament of the mountain wind. His workshop was a small, stout structure of stone and cedar, tucked into the lee of a granite outcropping. Inside, the air was a rich, heady brewer's sense, the sharp resin of pine, the mellow sweetness of aged oak, and the clean, medicinal aroma of beeswax. It was the blue hour, that brief window between afternoon and evening when the light on the snow turned a deep, electric indigo. For Silas, this was the hour of the first selection. He moved to the center of the room, where a cast-iron stove hummed with a steady, orange glow. The heat was a physical presence, a warm weight that countered the sharp cold pressing against the window panes. He reached for a heavy, rough-sawn block of cherry wood that had been seasoning near the rafters for 3 winters. He lifted the wood, feeling its density and its potential. To the untrained eye, it was merely a chunk of timber, but to Silas, it held a rhythm. He ran his thumb over the raw surface, tracing the invisible lines of the grain. He wasn't looking for beauty yet. He was looking for the root of the piece, the direction the tree had grown, the way it had leaned against the mountain gales. Listen to the wood, his own master had told him decades ago. The tree has already done the hard work of growing. Your job is simply to help it finish its thought. He carried the cherry block to his workbench, a massive slab of maple scarred by a lifetime of purposeful labor. He secured the wood in the vise with a series of slow, rhythmic turns. Crank, squeak, firm. The sound was a familiar greeting, an anchor in the quiet afternoon. Silas reached for his draw knife. The steel was cold, but the wooden handles, turned from applewood, were smooth and warm from years of use. He positioned the blade at the edge of the block. He took a breath, matching his movement to the rhythm of the falling snow outside. He pulled the knife toward him. Shihik! A long, curling ribbon of cherry wood peeled away, falling softly to the floorboards. It was a sound of release. Beneath the rough, weathered exterior, the wood revealed its true heart, a deep, warm cinnamon red, glowing in the lamplight. Silas repeated the motion. Pull, release, curl. Outside, the rain began to mix with the snow, a soft, rhythmic drumming against the cedar shingles of the roof. The sound was a constant, liquid white noise, isolating the workshop from the rest of the world. Here, in this circle of lamplight, there was no past and no future, only the steady progress of the blade and the growing pile of fragrant shavings at his feet. He worked with a slow, deliberate pace. He was not in a hurry to find the shape. He was simply getting to know the material. Every stroke revealed a new layer of the tree's history, a tight cluster of rings from a lean year of drought, a wide, generous stretch from a season of rain. He thought of the ridge itself, the way the roots of the pines gripped the stone, holding fast while the branches swayed in the storms. To be rooted did not mean to be stagnant. It meant to have a foundation so secure that you could afford to be flexible. Silas paused, his breath visible in the cooling air away from the stove. He picked up a handful of the fresh shavings, pressing them into his palm. They were soft, resilient, and carried the life force of the forest. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the rain on the roof and the scent of the cherry wood wash over him. The first ritual of the evening was complete. The wood was anchored. The outer layer was gone. The heart was exposed. He set the draw knife down and turned toward the stove to add a fresh log of birch. The fire snapped and popped in response, casting dancing shadows of chisels and mallets against the timber walls. The night was growing long, and the work of the grain had only just begun. The warmth from the birch log began to spread, a slow tide of heat that reached Silas where he stood at the workbench. The scent of the burning wood mingled with the cinnamon-sharp aroma of the cherry shavings, creating a fragrant sanctuary against the freezing night. Silas turned his attention to a small, heavy leather roll at the corner of the bench. He unknotted the thong and allowed the kit to unfurl. Inside lay his chisels, arranged by width and purpose, their steel faces gleaming like mirrors in the orange light of the stove. To a carver, the tool is not an object, but an extension of the intent. If the steel is dull, the thought is blurred. Silas picked up a wide-set gouge, feeling the cold weight of the blade. It had done good work on the pine benches last month, but for the cherry wood, it required a new level of precision. He moved to the sharpening station, a dedicated corner where a series of natural whetstones sat in a shallow cedar tray. He poured a few drops of clear, refined oil onto the finest stone. The oil beaded, then spread into a shimmering film. Silas positioned the blade at a precise angle, his movements guided by decades of muscle memory. Swish, swish, swish. The sound was a high-frequency whisper, a metallic song of refinement. He did not press hard. He allowed the stone to do the work, trusting in the slow, rhythmic friction. Outside, the rain had turned fully back to snow, a silent, heavy descent that seemed to press the very air into stillness. The workshop felt like a wooden ship floating on a white sea, isolated and safe. Silas wiped the blade with a piece of silk, then tested the edge against the hair on his forearm. The steel was now scary sharp, as his master used to say, capable of severing a fiber without crushing it. He returned to the cherry block, which sat waiting in the vise like a silent student. He positioned the gouge at the top edge, where he intended to begin the hollow of the bowl. He took a breath, letting it out slowly, and then tapped the handle of the gouge with a small, heavy mallet of hornbeam wood. Talk. A thick, crescent-shaped chip of wood popped into the air, revealing the shimmering, layered grain beneath. Talk, talk, talk. The rhythm established itself immediately. It was the heartbeat of the workshop. With every strike, Silas felt the resistance of the cherry wood. It was a stubborn timber, dense and unforgiving, requiring a firm hand and a clear mind. He encountered a small knot near the center, a place where a branch had once reached out toward the mountain sun. Instead of fighting it, he slowed his pace. He changed the angle of his tool, working around the obstacle with the patience of a river flowing around a stone. The knot was not a flaw. It was a character mark, a memory of the tree's struggle against the wind. To remove it would be to lie about the tree's life. As he carved deeper, the pile of shavings at his feet grew, a soft, fragrant carpet that muffled his footsteps. The work was demanding, but it was a rooted labor. It required him to be entirely present in the point where the steel met the grain. He thought of the people in the valley, perhaps already asleep under their heavy quilts, while he stood here, high on the ridge, helping a tree finish its thought. The blue hour had passed into the deep black of midnight. The only light in the world seemed to be the orange glow of the stove and the focused pool of amber light on his workbench. Silas paused, leaning his weight against the bench, feeling the vibration of the mountain wind through the floorboards. The bowl was beginning to emerge from the block, a graceful, concave curve that felt smooth and cool to the touch. He picked up a handful of the shavings and tossed them into the stove. They flared up instantly, a bright, crackling offering that sent a fresh wave of warmth into the room. The night was half gone, and the wood was beginning to speak. The fire in the birch stove had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse of heat, a deep crimson glow that felt like the workshop's own respiration. Silas stood back from the bench for a moment, his arms hanging loose, feeling the blood return to his fingers after the intense focus of the mallet work. The bowl was no longer a block. It was a vessel, a hollowed sanctuary that held the amber light of the lantern within its unfinished walls. He reached out, not with the tool, but with his bare hand, sliding his fingertips along the inner curve. The wood was cool where the steel had just passed, but beneath that surface, he could feel the lingering life of the cherry tree, a faint, resonant vibration that seemed to respond to the warmth of the room. He picked up a smaller, curved scraper, a simple piece of high-carbon steel that he had fashioned himself years ago. This was the work of the long watch, the hours where time ceased to be measured by the clock and began to be measured by the thinness of the shavings. Screech. The scraper moved with a high, melodic note, removing a dust so fine it was like cinnamon flour. It hung in the air for a second before settling onto the darker mounds of curls already on the floor. Silas focused on a specific area near the base where the grain took a sharp, beautiful turn, a place where the tree had once twisted to avoid the shadow of a larger neighbor. To carve this area required a change in breath. He inhaled as he positioned the blade and exhaled as he made the pass, a slow, tidal movement that kept his hand perfectly steady. Outside, the mountain wind had begun to hunt through the pines, a low, mournful whistle that buffeted the stone walls of the workshop. A fine drift of snow had begun to pile up against the bottom of the door, sealing the room in a natural insulation of white. Silas welcomed the isolation. He felt like a monk in a scriptorium, though his parchment was timber, and his ink was the natural oils of the wood. He moved his focus to the exterior of the bowl, turning the vise with a slow, deliberate creak. The outer surface was still rough, marked by the deep bites of the draw knife from the first hour. Now, he would introduce the block plane. He set the blade to a shallow depth, barely a hair's breadth of steel exposed. Shutuk. Shutuk. The sound was different now, more percussive, more rhythmic. With every pass, a long, translucent curl of cherry wood emerged from the top of the plane, spiraling into the air like a ribbon of silk before falling to join the others. These curls were so thin he could see the orange light of the stove through them. He thought of the roots of the cherry tree, how they had once moved through the dark earth with this same slow, unstoppable persistence, finding their way around granite and through clay to find the mountain springs. To be rooted was to be patient. To be rooted was to understand that the final shape is already there, waiting for the distractions to be removed. He paused to check the wall thickness, using his thumb and forefinger as a living caliper. He moved from the rim down toward the base, feeling for any inconsistency, any hidden weight that didn't belong. He found a slight heaviness on the western side of the bowl. He addressed it not with frustration, but with a quiet nod of recognition. The wood was telling him where it needed to be lighter. He worked for another hour in this state of active rest, his mind clear of the valley's worries, his hands moving in a dance of precision and grace. The pile of shavings now reached his shins, a soft, aromatic sea that muffled the sound of the wind. He felt a deep sense of companionship with the tools, the wood, and the silence. The bowl was beginning to take on a life of its own, a smooth, elegant curve that reflected the stillness of the midnight ridge. He set the plane down and reached for a piece of dried sharkskin, an ancient substitute for sandpaper. The texture was rough and honest. As he began the first stage of the final smoothing, the sound changed again, a low, rhythmic hush-hush-hush that matched the sound of the snow brushing against the window pane. The night was at its deepest point, the hour where the soul is most receptive to the quiet. Silas closed his eyes, letting his hands guide the work, trusting the memory of the grain and the wisdom of the ridge. He was no longer just making a bowl. He was participating in a ritual as old as the mountain itself. The texture of the cherry wood had transformed under the dried sharkskin, moving from the ridged honesty of the plain to a velvet-like softness that seemed to pull the lantern light deep into its fibers. Silas set the skin aside, his fingertips tingling with the memory of the friction. Now came the stage that required the most profound stillness, the burnishing. He reached into a small, velvet-lined wooden box on the high shelf and retrieved a stone he had found in the mountain stream 20 years ago. It was a piece of black basalt, perfectly egg-shaped, worn to a mirror finished by centuries of rushing water. This was his most trusted finisher. He held the stone in the palm of his hand for a moment, letting the warmth of his skin transfer to the cold mineral. Slide, press, rotate. The sound changed yet again. It was no longer a cutting or a scratching sound, but a silken, rhythmic slide, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the workbench and into his chest. This was the whisper of the stone. As he pressed the basalt against the rotating bowl, the wood cells were not removed, but compressed, laid flat in a single direction, creating a surface so dense and smooth it began to glow with a dull, internal luster. He followed the spiral of the grain, moving from the rim down into the deepest curve of the hollow. He thought of the mountain itself, how the glaciers had burnished the granite peaks, smoothing away the jagged edges through the slow, heavy passage of time. To be rooted was to endure the pressure until the beauty within was revealed. Outside, the wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving a silence so heavy it felt as though the workshop had been buried beneath 1,000 feet of wool. The only sound in the universe was the shhh slide of the stone. Silas paused at a single, thick log of oak to the stove. The birch had burned to a bed of glowing white embers, and the oak would provide the steady, long-lasting heat needed for the final hours of the watch. He watched the first blue flames lick around the new timber, a ritual of renewal that kept the frost from the corners of the room. He then moved to the small iron tripod sitting on the edge of the stove. In a heavy copper pot, he began the preparation of the finish, a mixture of refined walnut oil and pure yellow beeswax. He used a small wooden stirrer to incorporate the wax as it melted, the scent of the summer meadow suddenly filling the winter workshop. This was the breath of the forest, a combination of the tree's juice and the bees' labor. He stirred with a slow, clockwise motion, watching the liquid turn from a cloudy gold to a brilliant, clear amber. It was a transition of clarity, a physical reflection of the mental state required for the work. He returned to the bench for one last pass with the basalt stone, his eyes tracing the way the light now danced across the rim. The bowl was no longer just a piece of cherry wood, it had become a repository of his patience, a physical vessel for the stillness of the ridge. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the wood's cooperation, for the way it had yielded its knots and hidden its flaws to become something whole. The first hint of the false dawn began to touch the snow outside, a ghostly, violet light that made the trees look like silent sentinels. Silas stood at the threshold of completion, the bowl smooth and waiting, the oil warm and fragrant. He closed his eyes, centering his breath, preparing for the final ritual of the morning. Silas reached for a small, clean piece of undyed linen that had been warming on a stone near the stove. He folded the cloth into a tight, firm pad, a tool designed not to cut, but to nourish. He dipped the linen into the copper pot, watching as the pale fabric instantly darkened, saturated by the brilliant, amber mixture of walnut oil and beeswax. The liquid was warm, nearly the temperature of his own blood, and as he lifted it, the steam carried a concentrated essence of the high summer, the memory of nectar and the deep pulse of the sap. He approached the bowl, which sat in the center of the bench like a silent, waiting vessel. He made the first contact at the very center of the hollow. Hush, hush. The sound was a soft, liquid sigh as the thirsty cherry wood drank the oil. The transformation was instantaneous and breathtaking. Where the oil touched, the wood did not just darken, it awakened. The pale, velvet surface transformed into a deep, translucent mahogany, the grain lines flaring into life like hidden lightning caught in amber. Silas worked in widening circles, moving from the center toward the rim, his hand following the spiral he had carved hours before. The warmth of the oil allowed it to penetrate deep into the fibers, sealing the wood from the inside out, a ritual of protection that would last for a century. He moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, his breath steady and synchronized with the circular motion of his arm. Outside, the ghostly violet of the false dawn had deepened into a rich, glowing rose gold. The light began to crawl across the snow-covered ridge, catching the tips of the pines and turning them into flickering candles of green and white. Inside the workshop, the orange glow of the oak fire met the incoming morning light, creating a spectrum of warmth on the workbench. Silas turned the bowl, applying the finish to the exterior, watching as the light danced across the burnished surface. The basalt stone's labor was now fully revealed. The surface was so smooth it acted like a mirror, reflecting the flickering embers of the stove and the emerging blue of the sky. He felt a profound sense of completion, a quiet resonance between the tree that had grown, the stone that had burnished, and the hands that had guided. To be rooted was to participate in the cycle of giving, the tree giving its timber, the bee giving its wax, and the craftsman giving his time and stillness. He polished the rim one last time, the linen cloth moving with a silken, effortless glide. The bowl was no longer a block of cherry wood or a piece of timber. It was a physical manifestation of the night's silence, a captured moment of peace from the high ridge. He placed the linen pad back in the pot and stood for a moment, his hands resting on the edge of the workbench, watching the first true ray of sunlight pierce the window. The beam of light hit the bowl directly, igniting the grain and casting a warm, cinnamon glow across the workshop walls. Silas took a deep, final breath of the fragrant air, feeling the restoration of the morning wash over his tired limbs. He lifted the bowl gently and placed it on the high shelf in the window, where the cold morning air would help the wax cure into a hard, protective luster. He turned toward the stove, banking the fire with a layer of ash to keep the heat until his return. The long watch was over. The ridge was silent, the wood was finished, and the day was full of a new, grounded grace. Silas moved toward the small cot in the corner of the workshop, his mind clear and his spirit at rest. And in that quietude he slept,